Cyril Ramaphosa has a mandate now to, of course, get his state together and his party together and to help grow the economy. But what space does he have with a changed National Assembly and continued infighting in his party? Opposition politics have also changed. The Democratic Alliance is in a crisis. The EFF is finally a national party, and the Freedom Front Plus has grown. To make sense of all of this, I'm joined by my panel, Eusebius Mckaiser, author and analyst, and of course Ebrahim Fakir from the ASRI Foundation, also analyst. You've been looking at these numbers, you've been talking yourselves, deaf, and your voices have gone. But we've, of course, got to make sense of all of this. And there's a lot of really interesting questions that one can begin with. I want to actually keep the ANC for last, because I think the way in which the opposition performed in South Africa will tell us the ANC story. So I want to start with the opposition. Let me start with you, Eusebius. You were saying that there's a lot more complexity to what is happening in the DA that we've been writing about. Peter's, of course, been telling the DA that this is what's going to happen, and apparently it's now called the Bruce vote. But how do you understand the DA's lack of growth, its lack of identity, and its lack of clear policy positions?
I think it's incoherence and it's vagueness and it's a lack of certainty. I disagree with Peter that they do have an identity. I shared with Karima the example yesterday on radio, Peter, that if someone like a Gavin Davis, who used to be an MP of theirs, were to say, as he does on social media, I think color-coded language is the reason we did poorly, which is what he is suggesting. Identity politics explain why we were turning people off. And in the other corner, you have Eusebius, who is in favor of identitarian politics and in favor of racialized language to deal with injustice, who also says the DA turns me off. We can't both be right. And I think the logical inference is we don't know what they're about. What I agree with Peter about, and I think it's a profoundly important thing to push back against their attempt at self-examination, is that to say that you're a party for all South Africans is absolute nonsense. What does that actually mean? What does that actually mean? And then the other thing I would say, Karima, is that if you read the Sunday Times this morning, Chris Barron's interview with Athol Trollip shows you precisely what's wrong with some leaders in the DA. They are arrogant beyond belief. I'm gobsmacked, Peter. I've got it here on my phone. The guy has the audacity of saying, when Chris Barron puts to him, surely you guys now have to self-examine. Yeah. His answer is almost verbatim, no, the voters must self-examine. Yeah. And a 1% decline is actually a win for us. And the language that some of them are now using, that I found out through my contacts, is that they're going to spin this in the days ahead as a winning losses, it's
such as winning losses?
Winning losses, that's what they're calling it.
No, it's going to be, it's for people like us who do this for a living. I mean, it's, thank God, for the DA, because it's endless entertainment. I mean, the interview with Athol Trollip was just pathetic. And granted, look, I mean, that gets done on, I think, on a Friday. Maybe he'd have been a little less, he would have spoken differently had it been, at the end of the vote. They were still on 21, I think, when he was speaking. So one doesn't, but there is no introspection in that party. You have to be able to introspect, and it's difficult, Even doing it personally with one person, yourself, it's difficult. What is wrong? What is wrong? What have we done? And for me, the simple problem is this. I could think of 3 or 4 really good policy positions for the DA for free tomorrow. Yes. Now, on economic inclusion, but they're not interested in the economy. They discover the economy about 6 months before every election, and then they go on about it.
Absolutely.
And then forget about it. And they will use every opportunity for the next 4.5 years to attack Ramaphosa, make sure that the public protector, who's
now suddenly
become a hugely important figure to attack the.
And crucially, Peter, then also to infantilize the voters.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there'll be absolutely no politics. It'll simply be ad hominem attacks on various people, and they'll waste. I guarantee you that they'll waste this opportunity.
Yeah.
Ebrahim, let me bring you in here. Of course, it's not just the DA that is having a meltdown. A lot of smaller parties thought that fighting elections is an easy thing to do. They saw how really difficult it is to be just present in 22,000 voting stations. The attempt to try and discredit the process, was dominating headlines for a small little bit, and then people began to realize that, one needs to put this in context. You have worked with the IEC, you understand the IEC. Just from a process point of view, these smaller parties, what were the issues that they raised that one can say are legitimate criticisms, and what was just an attempt to give themselves a profile which they don't enjoy? I mean, Andile Mkitama says their votes were stolen. No one voted for them.
I mean, for instance, Claudia Motsoeneng apparently had 5,000 party agents. Even they didn't bother voting for his party. So you're pushing it a bit too far by saying, these guys weren't present in many of the voting stations because they didn't have party agents. It's a little more basic. They simply didn't know the process. Some of the parties simply didn't even know that you have things called a multi-party liaison committee, in which you caucus and you canvass and you try to find some consensus about contentious issues, right down to the fact about who's going to be the presiding officer, Eusebius or someone else.
Yes.
So you've got a bunch of parties which have absolutely no idea about how the system works, nothing about the intricacies and the balance and the oversight mechanisms, nothing about the procedural oversight and supervisory mechanisms. And so how do you deign to participate and volunteer yourself as being someone to be part of a process which you have no idea about?
Absolutely.
Frankly, it's as much hubris as the DA displays. And I've long been saying, just to come back into the point of the DA, that for as long as they acquire a greater amount of power, they will start to mirror some of the same problems that the ANC does.
They know everything.
You know everything, and the question of introspection is either you vilify voters or you vilify the electoral administrator, which the ANC was a past taskmaster at. So let's not just blame the small parties. Remember 2016, after the ANC lost the metros, its Secretary General at the time tells the IEC, you're part of the enemy. Now, if you have an assault on our independent institutions of that nature, then you've got to ask yourself serious questions of who you are.
Eusebius, you were making a very interesting point yesterday about the Freedom Front Plus. Okay, so the Freedom Front Plus surged, and you were saying it's not just those voters in the DA that were pissed off that the DA was giving off more time and resources to build a black power base so that there can be a government in waiting. There are other complex reasons for why people went to the Freedom Front Plus. The Freedom Front Plus talks about minority politics. Yesterday, Corne Mulder said, we are not a party of the past. We're actually the party of the future. This is the way of the world. Identity politics is growing everywhere. Is he right?
Well, yeah, the methodological point that I was trying to make is that instead of assuming who voted for the Freedom Front Plus, what we need to do journalistically is to go and find out who they are. I have now read some fantastic journalistic books, narrative journalism, about who the Trump supporters are. And when we sit on our armchairs, we imagine it must be only right-wing bigots that vote for Trump. And then you go and find out, you know what, these are people I can actually go to a barbecue with. This is someone I can have on. Or as the song Mr. Manka said of one right-wing politician, he's a nice racist. So the only thing that I'm saying is, we should not make assumptions as the commentariat and as journalists. And if I was still running, or if Peter was still running a newspaper, I would second one of my best writers interested in good narrative journalism and say to them, go and spend a week in the parts of the country that voted for the Freedom Front Plus and come back with the following questions answered. Who are these people? Are they really right-wing? Are they racist? And then along the way, interview the Freedom Front politicians themselves. And let's see whether they are the equivalent of America's alt-right or whether we are making assumptions about them. And I think there's a lack of complexity with which we treat both the Freedom Front Plus and also the EFF, other way around, the right and the left. And I think that's very dangerous. And we all assume ourselves to be occupying, as the commentariat, this imagined moral center.
Peter?
Yeah, I mean, Eusebius is right. You know, if one had the resources, one would go all the time. One would go and meet these people and learn about why they voted the way they voted. But I also think I know enough about this country to be able to tell myself what kind of people would vote for those kind of policies, because I have gone to barbecues with them lots of times, and I can imagine the conversation around the barbecue or the braai. Why did you say barbecue?
The old white version, right?
Got it in my mind. You know, yeah. Look, I feel I know why the Freedom Front exists. I'm not surprised that it did as well as it did. Its message was much more direct than, say, Musi Maimani's was. As Eusebius says, you can't be a party for everything.
Yeah.
And you're able to decide, if you're the Freedom Front, what to stand for, like the EFF can do it as well. But the bigger you become, and I don't know this, the bigger you become, the bigger the trap becomes that you will fall into being a broad church and become like everybody else.
Absolutely. Now, we've always said that the ANC is gifted with weak opposition. One of President Jacob Zuma's closest inner circle people before he was thrown under the bus was, of course, Hlaudi Motsoeneng. Let's take a listen to him speak to Annika Larsen about his chances. And I just want to use this point to segue into the conversation about the African National Congress and how they did at the polls.
I'm part of that group of 35 because in South Africa we can't allow people to rig the votes, because this is rigging. And if you look, if IEC is so fair, they should just rerun the elections, because they have already admitted people were arrested. If people
they found no evidence. They said they found no evidence of any double voting.
Why do you arrest the people if you don't have evidence? It doesn't make sense.
That is, of course, Hlaudi Motsoeneng's logic at its best. Now, I wanted to use that part to set up the conversation about the African National Congress, because, of course, it went into this election at war with itself. The president had a very narrow margin. We spent weeks discussing how narrow it is, what he can and he can't do. Let's start with you, Ebrahim. This is the worst that the ANC has done since the advent of democracy, but people said they wouldn't even make it this far. Why do you think the voters stuck with the African National Congress?
Well, clear, it's one simple factor, Ramaphosa. And so there's some justification now in retrospect for the Ramaphoria, but certainly not as much as Peter Bruce might have had. So that's not the sole deciding factor. Look, there is the reality that the ANC is still appreciated for what it's done in terms of service delivery, in terms of constructing the welfare state. But unfortunately, that's where it ends. You've got a much more sophisticated voter now, and you've got a much more rational voter. Not that the voter was never rational, always were. And they make these decisions on a fairly rational basis. We've spoken about this before. So that's the one set of factors. The second is people will make assumptions about the fact, and this is already happening in the ANC. Ramaphosa has actually led us to this big loss, because some of them call it a big loss. What they lose sight of the fact is that the voter turnout is down by a full 8%. That's a lot of voters. And if you look at the drop in ANC figures, not just the percentage, in terms of numbers, it's 1.5 million votes that they've lost. And that's not, there's no direct correlation between 1.5 million they lost and what the opposition picked up.
The other important point, Karima, to recognize, and there's a wonderful graphic to this effect in the Sunday Times today, is that if my math serves me correctly, approximately 6.4% of people who voted for the ANC nationally did not vote for them provincially.
Yeah, so people
they voted. Let me share my reference to the Peter Bruce logic with the Mckaiser logic. Mckaiser says in the New York Times, I'm going to hold my nose up as I vote for them. So a lot of them would have split it. So the good thing about the ANC politicians, even Jesse Duarte, who's normally arrogant AF, is that they recognize that many of the people who voted for them didn't give them an enthusiastic thumbs up. And that's why you see, for example, this discrepancy between their share of the national vote. But if you tally up the provinces as if it was a country, there is a difference between them of around 6%. That message must be taken to heart by Luthuli House.
Absolutely. Peter, I don't know if you saw the fantastic interview that was done with Ebrahim Rasool. He said precisely that. He was the first ANC politician who said, in the Western Cape voters don't trust us as the ANC. But a lot of them voted for the ANC nationally because they trusted the man who's leading the party. We're going to be discussing with the ANC after this break, the fact that the Secretary General, Ace Magashule, simply couldn't bring himself to concede that Ramaphosa was actually carrying the major
well, we've got the
burden
the math shows that he's wrong.
Of that. Yeah.
Well, I mean, one of the things that Ramaphosa, I don't know this. Can the NEC remove an elected official of the party?
No.
From office? No.
No, unless there's a special NEC, and there's or at the NGC they could sponsor a proposal, but that requires a certain threshold.
Yeah.
But let's recognize that the ANC went into this election on the back foot.
Yeah.
Election on election from 2009, cumulatively, they dropped on average 3%, number one. They then go into this election having lost complete influence over the drivers of growth in the economy. So these are the people who are connected to the global elite. These are the people who drive business, commerce, and the fourth industrial revolution just to sneak it in through the back door, since everyone ignored it, after the campaign.
Including the
IEC. Their scanners can't even keep up with the fourth. So they lose this whole influence over the drivers of growth and redistribution. That must say something to you. They're lucky that they won this election. In Britain, Labour lost the election once they lost influence over the metropolitan elite.
Okay, that's where we will have to leave it. Of course, it's stuff that we're going to be unpacking for months to come as we lead up to the inauguration. And of course, we also see which kind of people are going to be on that list. After this, we hear from the governing party and make sense of their performance at the polls. We also get reaction from its alliance partner, the SACP, who, unlike the NUMSA leadership, decided to stick with the ANC because they knew the working class will continue to vote for it. See you after the break.